Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 170. And this time I'm going to talk about Sonny Rollins' masterpiece from 1956, Saxophone Colossus. Just before I do, though, I'm going to give a shout out to Jonas, who goes by Sublime Media, who gave me a shout out the other day, and I highly recommend his channel. It's got a huge collection, very big into prog and also jazz, and lots of interesting little tidbits and a lot of stuff about what in North America we would consider to be relatively obscure Scandinavian stuff, but some pretty cool things he finds there. Anyway, Sublime Media, Jonas recommended. This is a 2011 release on original jazz classics. Originally, of course, it came out on Prestige. This is probably one of the best sounding OJC reissues, which I think dates from 2011. So this record occurs in the midst of a flurry of albums that Rollins did after he got clean in 1955. And between 56 and 57, he does, I think, a total of 6 albums as a leader. This one, perhaps above all of them, establishes him as a major force in the jazz world. It's an interesting record historically, too, because it kind of straddles the divide between bebop and hard bop and its more contemporary manifestations. It's got 5 fairly lengthy songs, which is not that unusual, of course, for a jazz record these days. I mean, it's not unusual, actually, to have a track that occupies the whole side of a record. But then, in 1956, 57, it was. Jazz, much as pop music would be in the 1960s, was still kind of in the grip of short 3 to 4 minute tracks that were relatively radio-friendly, and Rollins just blows all this out of the water. There's nothing on here shorter than 5 minutes and change. Blue 7's over 11 minutes long, and this is very clearly music which does not aspire to be played on the radio because of that length. It's music to play at home, to really listen to. This was not really aspiring to be popular music. This, of course, is a great development for jazz because it opens the door to so much fantastic, long-form experimental music to come, whether it's Davis or Coltrane or Sanders or you name it. But it's also kind of an ominous development for jazz because it contributes to this long departure of jazz from music which was basically popular music, which is what it was, the leading popular music in the 1940s and early 1950s, to its current niche where it's discussed passionately by middle-aged men with beards. So when I reviewed Tenor Madness, which was the album which came out just before this, I had actually given a bit of a thumbnail sketch of Sonny Rollins' early life. The short version of that is that he was really making his name in the early 1950s as a tenor player, including playing and recording with Miles Davis. But he also had a significant heroin habit, being influenced, as so many players were, by Charlie Parker, and thinking, well, this is exactly how you had to chase what Parker had. One of the markers of his career overall is that he takes several significant breaks from playing and recording, and one of these occurs in 1955 when he decides to get clean. Heroin, of course, like so many drugs, moves from being legal to illegal based on essentially arbitrary whim and morality and various religious influences and so on. There's never any actual, or rarely any, scientific sense to criminalization of drugs. It was legal, of course, in the early part of the 20th century and became a pretty big social problem. In 1933, the Roosevelt administration creates this outfit called the U.S. Narcotics Farm in Lexington, Kentucky, which subsequently got a rather more serious and governmenty sounding name, the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital. For patients, they took on volunteers for the community who were addicted. They also took prison inmates. They were amongst the very first places to use methadone as a therapy. There was also extensive vocational training. You basically learned a trade in there so you're ready to reintegrate into community. So it was really not that distinct from the kinds of approaches that are taken today. Plenty of musicians went through the program. Chet Baker did, and of course Sonny Rollins. For Rollins, the experience was quite profound. He got clean. He also found a variety of depths or levels of spirituality. Eventually, he, of course, would ultimately be a very spiritual guy. When he left the facility, he had actually had an offer from Miles Davis to join his quintet, which he turned down. Davis had to settle for John Coltrane. And Rollins goes to Chicago, where he takes a bit of a gap year, and he works in construction and so on, and eventually comes back to New York, and he joins the Clifford Brown and Max Roach quintet. Brown was a very significant influence on Rollins because he was a wonderful trumpeter and widely admired amongst jazz musicians. And Rollins himself, who didn't lack for a little bit of ego, felt that Brown was really one of his rare equals in the jazz world. Anyway, Brown, of course, was clean-cut, totally clean, kind of an intellectual, thoughtful guy. seemed to be an example to Rollins that you didn't actually have to be on smack to be able to play at the level that people like Charlie Parker did. So huge influence, and very sadly, of course, was to die in a car crash not long after. Anyway, by 1956, Sonny's clean, he's back in New York, and he is determined to make his mark, and he releases this epic string of records, including Work Time, Moving Out, +4, Tenor Madness, this record, and Tour de Force. This record is made June 22nd, 1956, in the front room of Rudy Van Gelder's parents in Hackensack, New Jersey, which was, of course, was the first place that Rudy Van Gelder set up before he built his famous studio in Englewood Cliffs. This is acoustic jazz, absolutely brilliantly captured. The group, of course, was led by Rollins, who, after his break, seems to me to have a more kind of mature and rounder tone to his tenor playing. Max Roach, of course, arguably the most famous drummer in jazz history. Tommy Flanagan is the piano player. He's from Detroit, like so many great musicians. He was heavily influenced, as were so many people, by Bud Powell, who really is kind of the Charlie Parker of the piano, and that he, as a bebopper, or from that era, influenced basically a whole generation of players in his particular instrument. On bass is Doug Watkins, who's another guy from Detroit, and he at the time he was an original member of the Jazz Messengers with Art Blakey and Horace Silver, and I think at this time he's still with them, so he's freelancing as a sideman. The album starts with a track which is a bit of a signature track for Rollins, St. Thomas, which is named after the Virgin Islands location, so he's reflecting his parents' heritage. This has quite a famous melody. It's a very catchy head arrangement, and then some really playful improvisation by Rollins. One thing which really characterizes Rollins' playing compared to some of his probably equally esteemed contemporaries is he's always a little bit, or not always, but often a bit whimsical, playful, witty in his playing. Not something you could say about Coltrane. I was mentioning that in Tenor Madness. Not something you could really say about Davis either, but definitely characteristic of Rollins is true on this track. The song was also distinguished by a drum solo from Roach, which is technically excellent, also I think quite playful and cheerful, and some lovely soloing by Flanagan, who may be not quite the level of those other two players, but still acquits himself pretty well. Next song is You Don't Know What Love Is, which Miles Davis originally had plucked out of the score to an old Abbott and Costello movie, of all things, and had turned it into a bit of a standard. As it's interpreted here, it's a slow blues. It has absolutely brilliant, expressive playing by Sonny. This isn't sort of the witty side of Sonny. This is the emotive side, and I find myself anyway, get carried away by his playing. The mood changes for the last track of side one, which is Strode Road, which is a really nice, fast-paced piece of bop. Sonny takes the first lead, then Flanagan. This swings really hard, beginning to end. It's a great way to end the side. Side two starts with Moritat, which is the theme from Bertolt Brecht's The Threepenny Opera, better known to most of us these days, well, I don't know if these days, this is now even kind of a dated reference, as the melody from Mac the Knife, sung by Bobby Darin. Sonny takes the head melody in the very first solo, and then Flanagan, probably his most fluid playing in the whole record. Roach offers some very cool fills, kind of alternating with Rollins, and then he takes a more substantial solo. At this point, finally, we hear from Watkins, who's kind of stayed out of the limelight, and a lovely piece of playing here, and then Rollins comes in to finish off the song. My favorite piece, however, is the last track, Blue 7, which is this 11-minute long song, which I mentioned. And this, again, was the one which was spontaneously composed in the studio. Given its length, as you might expect, everybody gets a bit of time to shine here. But for me, the most compelling part of this is the way that Rollins is playing is very tentative at first, but then he just slowly puts his hands in the handlebars as he moves forward, and you're kind of carried along with it. There's points of restraint here, there's points of exuberance, and overall, it's a fine track to cap off really a tour through all of the most interesting and compelling styles of jazz that were contemporary at that point. This is a truly wonderful jazz record. It's from that period where the jazz idiom is really expanding. So there's lots in here that would appeal to people who consider themselves to be, mainstream or traditional jazz fans. But there's also enough in here which is kind of envelope pushing to appeal to folks who like their jazz to have a bit of an edge. In his string of producing 6 records in that year as a leader, this is probably the best of the lot, and arguably it's his best record of his whole career. It's full of surprises. It's a beautiful sounding album. I really can't stress that enough, how lovely the sounds coming back from the speakers. It's an essential piece of collecting for any jazz collection, and it's 5 out of 5 stars.